If you've never been to Cambodia, but have seen photos or video footage of it, you've most likely seen one of two things. You've either seen some kind of archival footage of the Khmer Rouge, the notorious radical group that took power in the mid-70s and proceeded to destroy nearly a third of its own population. Or you've seen the images of the magnificent Angkor Wat temples, the incredible stone structures built sometime in the 12th century and then kind of forgotten until they were rediscovered by French explorer Henri Mahot around 1860. Even in photographs, these temples incite ums and ahs, but to see them in person, it's a powerful, mind-blowing experience. The faces of the ruling Angkorian king, Jayavarman VII, that protrude out of these giant monoliths are forever sealed on your brain once you've seen them in person. I truly never grow tired of seeing these temples up close, although until this trip, it had been years since I'd visited the temples in the town of Siem Reap, ground zero for all things Angkor Wat, and all things touristic. Over the past decade, Siem Reap had really become pretty inundated with tourists, or barang, as they like to call tourists in Cambodia, and I tended to stay away from this kind of action. Now, it wasn't quite the hedonism and crowded streets of Khao Sarn in Bangkok, but it also wasn't that far off. But my friend and filmmaking companion Patrick, he had a place that he was renting up in Siem Reap, and I needed to shoot some scenes there, specifically B-roll, so we decided to head up there after our time in Kampot. As it had turned out, Kampot hadn't been nearly as successful a filming trip as our time with Seng Dara and Chumnik had been. You'll remember, we had been filming Seng Dara and his family in his hometown during the Chinese New Year. Well, the bulk of that New Year we spent down in Kampot, a town and province down in the southern part of Cambodia, quite close to the beach resort town of Kaip. Kampot and Kaip had traditionally always been one of my favorite spots in all of the country, even if previously Patrick had had to find a doctor to hook me up to an IV to get my system back in order. In any case, this time out, Kampot had turned out to be a bit of a disaster. It wasn't Kampot's fault. It was our fault. Traveling anywhere in Cambodia during the Chinese New Year and trying to meet with people or businesses, it's a highly unadvisable thing. So when we'd set out there to try and film a particular scene of a particular Sun Si Samut song, Kampot Kampul Dong Chait, we didn't anticipate how difficult it was going to be navigating through the throngs of people that had descended upon the beach town for the holidays. And we hadn't anticipated having such difficulty finding a place to stay, or more importantly, an artist that we could film depicting the Sun Si Samut song. But that was Kampot. It didn't work out as planned. We hadn't found an artist to film, so we were now on our way to Siem Reap to try and film an artist who could depict the famous Sun Si Samut song that he had written about Siem Reap, aptly titled Champai Siem Reap. I should probably explain a little something here. The main subject of our film, Sun Si Samut, the most famous singer to ever come out of Cambodia, was killed during the Khmer Rouge time in 1975. Which is something that the Khmer Rouge were quite known for. Killing the artists, the doctors, the teachers, the educated, and destroying the libraries, books, personal properties, law records, money, anything that depicted Cambodia prior to 1975, destroyed. Even the majority of Angkor Wat's temples had the Buddha statues beheaded or dismembered. And because of this, we were not only making a film that was about the legacy of a man who was no longer alive, but to our knowledge and research, only had one single piece of archival footage of him, a short clip from a movie that he had been in called Apsara. So, a huge challenge for us with this film was figuring out creative ways to depict Sun Si Samut and in many ways Cambodia of the 60s and 70s. This was obviously not really a surprise to us since we were well aware of the lack of photos, footage, and even recordings from that time. We knew very early on that we would need to embrace a very different approach to telling this story, certainly in the case of the visual aspect of storytelling. And this involved our approach to B-roll. B-roll is just one of those pieces of filmmaking that can either make your documentary look like just another talking head film with the occasional B-roll shots edited in, or it can take your documentary film to another level of complexity. A lot of docs that you'll see, you can kind of tell that the filmmaker shot an interview and then based on the content of that interview, afterwards went and shot B-roll shots that went along with what was being said. And that's totally acceptable. It's a formula that can work, right? But we felt that with Elvis of Cambodia, that kind of approach to B-roll just wasn't going to, well, shall I say, cut it. We sensed early on that if we were to have any success with this film, and that if we wanted to create a film about one of the most extraordinary artists Cambodia has ever known, then we were going to have to do our best to match that artistry. And therefore, we had to make something like our B-roll one of the more compelling elements to our film. This morning was to be our second of 3 shoots with artists that were depicting a very specific Sun Si Samut song that depicted a very specific place in Cambodia. As already mentioned, Kampot hadn't worked out too well, and we were either going to have to cut the Kampot scene or at some point get back down there to try and shoot again. So this scene that we were about to shoot with an artist here in Siem Reap was actually the first in the series that we were doing. The idea here was to take a local artist, or Viche Takar as they say in Khmer, have them listen to the Sun Si Samut song, and then have them create what the song meant to them. Our Viche Takar in Siem Reap was a painter in his late 30s, a Cambodian military man who was making the majority of his money by selling his paintings of Angkor in Siem Reap. He had this welcoming smile and really seemed to get what we were trying to do, and so we were pretty excited about spending the day filming with him.
So as you can probably make out behind me, we are currently in the process of the first of 3 sequences we'll be shooting with a local artist from a town in which Sun Si Samut sang a very specific song. This is Siem Reap, and this is for the Champai Siem Reap song. Let's get a closer look at our Viche Takar, which is Khmer for artist. Let's see what's happening here on set.
In terms of approach, we decided on a multi-camera type of strategy. I would man the main camera, which was our Canon C300 Mark II, and Patrick would use his Sony A7S II on a slider. We'd also shoot some time-lapse stuff with a GoPro, and then also use an additional Canon 7D. The idea was that this scene would play over the entirety of the song. We'd start very close in, and we'd gradually move out until eventually, by the end of the song, we would completely reveal the artist and their work. Our shots would be intercut with one another. Now there might be very tight shots of paintbrush tips dipping into paint, or brush strokes across the canvas. There'd be some tights on hands and eyeballs, slow movements from trees or flowers, or figures as the song progressed and the painting started to take shape. Patrick and I would move and work around one another all day. We'd switch up lenses, camera positions, slider movements, even a few drone shots for good measure. And we would kind of do our very best to avoid distracting our Viche Takar or our painter and just let him get into the flow of his work while we did the same. Again, the whole idea here was to try and shoot our B-roll for the scene in as artistically a way as possible, an artist and his or her work depicting an artist singing about their town or province. At the end of the day, what resulted was this kind of dance amongst a handful of artists, all with great respect for one another's work, and ultimately, all with great reverence for one of the most profound artists this country has ever known. It was a deeply satisfying day, and later on, as Patrick and I sat and watched some of the dailies, we were left with the sense that the B-roll that we had shot on that day was exactly the kind of B-roll that was going to be needed to elevate and celebrate the story and the figure of our film. And other than a few tweaks here and there, exactly what and how we needed to shoot the remaining 2 Viche Takar scenes. You've been listening to part 6 of our Chris in Cambodia series. I'd like to encourage you to really try and think outside of the box when it comes to shooting B-roll for your own documentaries, and to try and get away from the conventional shooting of interviews and then filming of cutaways afterwards, and instead to try and find more compelling and complex ways in which to shoot your B-roll. If you can, think about what your film might look like without the interview, without the safety net of words, and see if you can visualize a more interesting way in which to visually depict the story of your documentary film. I'll also just quickly mention that you don't always have to fully plan out your B-roll shots all of the time. Sometimes a very interesting shot may present itself when you least expect it, but maybe you decline to shoot it, thinking that it's not something you'd find a way to use. Well, I'm here to tell you that you should shoot it anyway. There is a reason that something caught your eye or looked good in your frame. You may not understand those reasons at the time, but you should trust your instinct anyway. You'll be amazed at how once you sit down and begin editing, a shot that you were unsure of at the time, it might suddenly really elevate a scene or moment in a totally unexpected but quite beautiful way. So please, whenever you see the possibility for an interesting shot, just shoot it. If you'd like to see some of our interesting shots and behind-the-scenes footage of our film shoot with the artist of Siem Reap, you can check out the show notes for this episode and others by going to our website at thedocumentarylife.com. Up next on TDL, our weekly conversation with a documentary industry guest. And I have a feeling that you're really going to like this one. That's all coming up next, here on The Documentary Life.